Will be getting out, it would appear anyways, any list of notes, which simply means that the Lord only knows exactly what it is that He's going to be saying to us.
What would you charge us?
But I know it's going to be a very special treat.
Based on the number of families.
And
Say 300 families.
he is back by popular demand in this role. I think this is your third time, isn't it? And I want to welcome very much again to the podium Dr. Christian Kopff. And thank you very much. Thank you for that. Well, I guess might be called a generous introduction. I'm not quite sure.
42,000.
There's a little hint there that this happens every year. When watching the popular movies, Terminator 3, you may have noticed that we thought we'd avoided the inevitable rise of the machines, but turns out you can't avoid the inevitable. Nothing can stop it. Actually, the committee worked very hard to get another speaker, but Pastor Banquet was busy this week. I personally think that for a conference on classical Christian education, it would have been a very interesting talk to hear why pagans and Christians worship the same God. Extremely interesting discussion there. It could have ended with the famous Erasmus prayer from his colloquy, Sancte Socrates, ora nobis, Saint Socrates, pray for us.
I understand what you're saying. Just explain to him the practice of
Perfect beginning. That would be the ending. I assume the beginning would have been reading some of the beautiful passages about the immortality of the soul from Plato's Phaedo, and then speech would have begun, we're all stronger now than we were an hour before. Well, except for Socrates, he just took hemlock, I'm afraid. He's not stronger than he was. Sorry, Socrates. He'll be able to pray for us by the end of the meeting. He's on that way. Now, this is a select group that can appreciate these comments. You're not in Las Vegas with this. Nothing happens. No one's laughing. Can't understand it, really. We have been talking about a kind of education which has been associated with Christianity almost from its beginning. But we're in a time where we are beginning again something that's very old. But the thought of divorcing Christianity from a classical education has occurred before. In the 4th century, when the Emperor Justinian first legalized Christianity, and the rulers were one after another Christian, there was a brief period, 361 to 63, when a pagan became emperor, the Emperor Julian. And at one stage, he even forbade Christian teachers. Teachers should be sincere, and someone who doesn't believe in the gods of Homer and Greek tragedy shouldn't be teaching Homer and Greek tragedy. It's something that may seem strange to us, but just recently there was a biologist down in Texas, you may remember, who would ask his students whether or not how human beings came into existence. Because if you're going to teach biology, you had to disbelieve in God. Fortunately, the federal government in his case, and God in the case of Julian, took care of that particular problem. But the challenge was genuinely there. The Christians might be cut off from education. And it was not just the death of the Emperor Julian. Great Greek fathers like the Cappadocians, in the East, great Latin fathers like Ambrose and Jerome and Augustine fought for the classical tradition, insisted that Christianity and the classical culture belonged together. At the time of the Reformation, there were those who, again, wanted to reject it. And we hear from Luther's polemics, the people who came to him and said, what do we need Greek and Latin for? Arithmetic and German is all we need. The the time of the American Revolution. There were not only intellectuals, there was one of the great leaders of the Revolution, Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the great patriots, who in fact argued against classical education, excuse me, and helped found a school in Philadelphia without it. There again, not only ordinary Americans, but great leaders like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, stood up for the classics and argued how essential it was for America not to lose their contact. Adams' great comment was, I cannot go along with our friend Rush. I would as soon shut the shutters on my windows to be able to read better as to cut ourselves off from the classical past to improve Republican institutions. And Jefferson had very similar comments. So in our age, when we see a revulsion against the classical tradition, we've seen this before, and it's been stopped before. It's only been, in 1963, there were almost 800,000 high school students of Latin in this country. It's only in the relatively recent past that study of the classical world has become marginalized in the way it has. And the question arises, as it arose for the Cappadocians, and for Augustine, and for Luther, and Calvin, and for Adams and Jefferson, so what? Suppose we gave up on it. We happen to live in a wealthy and successful society. We live in one that dominates most of the world, either directly or through our influence in other ways. We have fantastic wealth. We have fantastic science and the technology based on science. I mean, is it going to be so terrible if we stop teaching these subjects just because in the past they have been so often associated with culture and religion and prosperity? And it would be nice to be able to point to a case where there was a great high culture, a great high urban culture, which was able to conquer, which was able to influence areas didn't conquer, which had a great art rooted in the classical past, fantastic science based on the classical past. Science has to be based on the classical past. The Greeks were the ones who started science going, and turned their back on the classical tradition, and to see what happened to them. It would be interesting if we find a culture like that. Well, obviously, I wouldn't have brought it up if I couldn't think of one. Gee, I can't think of one, so let's go start drinking. And the fact is, it's not just an interesting problem in comparative history or comparative education. There are many people in America who think that it's also one of the most, I guess everybody thinks it's one of the most serious problems that face us today, and some people think it's the most serious problem, because the culture I'm talking about is the culture of Islam. Islamic culture at its height, by about 800 to about 1300 AD, was a fantastic urban culture. It had spread from those early years, because the early years were tough years. The first, Muhammad fled Medina in 622, didn't look like much was going to happen. And the 200 years that followed, Islam conquered, spread its influence, and then developed its own distinctive culture. But it did so on a classical basis. If I had slides here today, what I could show you is the way that one of the most distinctive aspects of Islam, those beautiful turreted and domed buildings, are a distinctive Islamic development of the Roman dome. As a matter of fact, the fantastic technology and architecture typical of Islam built on the Roman aqueducts, the Roman domes, and then did what real tradition does, because tradition isn't just memorizing the past. Real tradition is memorizing the past first, then thinking about it, then using that for your current situation. And Islamic art, it was a fantastic development of the Roman traditions in both, well, really technology in both cases, but architecture and the technology connected with architecture. But they took what was there and yet developed in their own distinctive way. So as clearly as we can show that the Islamic domes of their great buildings come from the Roman domes of the Pantheon, for example, we can also tell in a minute, you don't have to be an art historian to tell the difference between the distinctively Roman and the distinctively Islamic. The same thing is true in science. We're only just beginning to appreciate really how distinctive it was, but that's our fault, because our ancestors in the Middle Ages appreciated very well that the source of science in that great period, about 800 to about 1300, was Islam. They were the people who took the Greek tradition. In the case of architecture and art, it was the Roman tradition. In the case of science, it was the Greek tradition. Got the works of Aristotle translated, and this began in the 8th century. In the 9th century, with the great work of the great rulers of Baghdad, and the great kingdoms founded there, and massively translated these great works. There remain to this day works of the great Greek mathematician Archimedes that we only have in Arabic translations. We've lost the Greek originals. Even in the case of some more distinctive figures, like the Aristotelian tradition, which includes not just Aristotle's writings, but all the late ancient commentators, more of it is translated into Arabic than into any individual European language. More of Galen, the great Greek doctor, who really saved Hippocrates as both his commentaries and his original research in the 2nd century AD, survives in Arabic translations than in any individual European translation. Of course, altogether, Europe has done most of the translating. And they not only had translated these works, they did their own research based on it, and made them distinctively their own. One of the most striking examples of this is the case of the great astronomical work of the great Ptolemy. The syntaxis in Greek, the great syntaxis, the great ordering. That's what it was also called by the Arabs. The Greek word for greatest is megiste, and they added their own word, the al-megiste. In fact, the almagest is the way that Ptolemy's work is known even in Europe. It's really Greek, it's a syntaxis, because it was the great Arabic civilizations of Islam, and also Persian as well, it ought to be said, well, not only Arabic, that took this work and continued to do research on it, continued to develop it on. Now, as we know, they didn't confront the great central problem there, which later we find Copernicus confronted. But they did enormous amount of observation, research, and improvement. And when Ptolemy came back to Europe, in the process that led to Copernicus, Tycho Brahe, Kepler, etc., it was initially through Arabic sources. That's also true in the case of mathematics. Geometry never interested them as much as it interested others, but they were, of course, interested in their favorite subject, algebra, which we mispronounce as algebra, but I probably mispronounced algebra also, so that's okay, I guess, where very original work was done in these areas developing. In fact, area after area of science, algorithm, look for an al at the front of the scientific term. It's very likely either a pure Arabic word or it's a Greek word with the Arabic word for the stuck in the beginning. This was a culture that was a conquering culture. It was an influencing culture. The growth of scholastic philosophy in Europe comes initially from the study of the Arabic commentators on the Greeks, Avicenna, Averroes. These are the people that are studied first. The great innovation of Thomas Aquinas and the great genius of Aquinas was to go back to Aristotle directly, get his friend William of Verbeke to translate the Greek for him directly, not through the Arabic. And this was a very rich and powerful country, and it was also a creative culture, not just one country, but many. It was also a scientifically active culture, especially in astronomy and in medicine and in mathematics. And the genius of Arabic doctors that were famous all over the world was based directly on the fact that they went back to Hippocrates and Galen, the great Greek doctors, and then used their own local culture to develop that and to move on, which is exactly what happened in modern Europe in the 16th and 17th century. Exactly the same process. What happened? Because we know the Islamic culture of today. Angry, bitter culture, loyal to its religion, remembering its great past, and frustrated that such a miserable part of the world as Europe was in the Middle Ages now has this incredible wealth, influence, power, artistic creativity, and scientific and technological creativity, which they had, which the record is very clear about. What happened to them? Well, the books can't make up their mind. The scholars can't decide. Of course, there's the blame the fundamentalists, of course, right? Well, Arabic, Islamic fundamentalists, why they're fundamentalists, never figured out, but we all agree that they are, right? And the Arabic fundamentalists took over. Well, that's the situation we see now in some places. It certainly wasn't what was happening in the 13th century, the 14th century. The Mongol invasions. Well, there's no question that the Mongol invasions were very significant. Islam had a catastrophe that never exactly happened to the Christian world. We had barbarians who came after us and ruined England and wreaked havoc all throughout Europe. But then when they converted to Christianity, they eventually ceased to be barbarians. By the way, I'm just reading a wonderful new book by Peter Green, one of the great scholars on late antiquity and the Middle Ages, who's explained to us that we shouldn't call them barbarians anymore. I mean, it's bad enough we can't insult the people who are around. Now we can't even insult the dead people. Really, barbarians' feelings will be hurt if we call them barbarians. So I don't know what we're going to be able to teach anymore. Well, the people have to be polite to the kindly Danish sailors who visited England in the time of King Alfred. Can't even call them barbarians anymore. But anyhow, when they get the Norsemen, when they did their worst, they were not yet Christian. In fact, the Christianizing was one of the great processes that took on. Islam had quite a different shock. The conversion of the Mongols to Islam led them to sweep across Islamic territory and really wreak havoc at two different times, as a matter of fact. And there's no question that it happened during the 13th century. And there are many people who would ally what happened to that traumatic event. The thing is, people get conquered honestly all the time. And in fact, what the people formerly known as barbarians did to the Roman Empire was much worse than what the Mongols did to the Islamic world. And as we all know, Europe came back. Not only came back, but produced a great and creative culture rooted in the classical past. And at one of the times that Christianity almost lost the classical tradition was precisely the Dark Ages, when the attacks from the formerly barbarian threatened to sweep away civilization. The great thing was, as soon as things calmed down, there's Charlemagne bringing Alcuin in to restore the classical tradition. That, of course, wasn't by any choice that it was lost, but by warfare. So that the Mongol invasion should have had this permanent effect of demoralization, destruction of creativity, and loss of contact with the scientific creativity is possible. One shouldn't discount the influence of the Depression that happened. But after all, beating people of Islamic faith doesn't seem to discourage them very much. You said, certainly isn't our experience yet. The more we beat them, the madder they get. And I think there's a lot of reasons to think they respond to the Mongols in exactly the same way. The mystery is, and this is what I don't see discussed in the number of excellent books that are out there about what happened to Islam, what happened to this fantastically creative, civilization that was creative in just the kind of ways we are now creative, and that Europe has been creative since the 16th century. And the one thing I don't see discussed is, what is the thing they did when they were creative, from about 800 to 1300, give or take? There are people before and those after, of course, but still, that we just started doing around, the 15th century and continue till very recently. Okay, I know this is my favorite topic, but it still also happens to be true. Islam built on the classical tradition. They were fanatically devoted to it. They translated more Greek works than we have ever done. They used the Greeks more thoroughly in their science, math, medicine, astronomy. Well, not more than we did, but just as much as we did. Their most fantastic art, especially their architecture, which is the art, Islamic art most of us can appreciate the most, is both distinctly original and yet clearly planted and rooted in the Roman and classical past. And that's exactly what we see happen in the time of the Renaissance and Reformation. Europe going ad fontes, back to its sources in history, back to its sources in art. What does Michelangelo do when he signs to make the Pietà? I promise I will create a statue the most beautiful since the ancient world. Now, aside that that's a very bad contract to sign, and if your children go into art, do not sign contracts like that. It's still true that that's what you're thinking. Even a person as seemingly cut off from our view of the world as Machiavelli, he didn't only write The Prince. He also wrote a long book of discourses on the first 10 books of Livy, because the origins of Rome were important for an Italian and a European to know, and our founders agreed with that 100%. Again and again, whether it's Martin Luther going back to the classical origins of Christianity, Machiavelli, the classical origins of Italy, Michelangelo looking for the classical origins of great art. You just run through the list. We see people in Europe creating this great civilization because it's rooted in the classical past. The tragedy of Islam, and it's really the tragedy of all of us, because of their influence around the world. They did not lose their religion. They did not lose their faith. That they still have. That has kept them alive as what they are. What they lost is the great art, the great creativity in science, the ability to dominate as a social and cultural force. And the one factor that fits with their fall, their rise and fall, and fits with our rise, is commitment to the classical past, knowledge of that past. We do know of a great civilization, influential, wealthy, conquering, creative in art, creative in science, that turned its back on the classical past and tried to live only from one source. You still survive, it doesn't kill you, but you lose the great creativity and freedom that's there. This is why what we're doing here and what we're talking about here is so important, because we can see our own country on the verge of making that same tragic mistake. And because we have the armies, and because we're conquering, and because we have the great popular art, and because we have the fantastic science and technology, we're sure that it won't go away. Why should it go away? Has it ever gone away in the past? And the answer is yes. And that's one of the lessons we need to remember why what we're doing is one of the most important things any educators and any students and any teachers in America are doing. Because we're keeping our culture alive. And by the way, let's not tell the Muslims right away, okay? Thank you very much for your kind attention.